Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our event on state efforts to decarbonize key industrial sectors. See if we can get the slides up. My name is Jamie Friedman. I'm a policy analyst on our domestic climate change team here at the Center for American Progress. I was one of the authors on our report of the same name, State Efforts to Decarbonize Key Industrial Sectors, along with my colleagues, CAP Senior Fellow Mike Williams and State Climate Policy Associate Director Rima Bazia, who will be moderating our panel today. First, I'll be doing about 10 minutes of presentation about the report, in which we wanted to look at how state policies currently existing for decarbonizing and detoxifying key industrial sectors, mainly focused on the emissions from the production of building materials, and pull out any lessons that states could learn from one another. After the presentation, we'll have our panel discussion moderated by Rima with three fantastic panelists, two of whom will be able to talk about the state programs that they've worked on. Will Manis, a senior program manager for the Colorado Energy Office, and Louis Crack, the infrastructure implementation coordinator at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And we'll also have Michelle Roberts, the national co-coordinator of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, who can speak more to detoxification efforts and environmental justice consideration, and who, along with her team, worked really closely with us on developing this report. So we're really grateful to have these panelists joining us today. After the panel, we'll have about 15 minutes for an audience Q&A. So please go ahead and add any questions you have throughout to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll compile those for the end of the event. And now I'll be diving into the presentation. Great, so there is a link there for the full report as well. Try to give a bit of an overview and not get as much into details. But going to start with why it is essential that we quickly work to decarbonize the industrial sector. So the industrial sector accounts for nearly 1/3 of our annual greenhouse gas emissions in the US and is the second highest emitting sector in the US after transportation. It's projected to be the highest by 2035, so it's going to be on the rise. And globally, we've seen industrial sector emissions rise dramatically and faster than any other sector, with a 70% increase since 1990. Industrial emissions also emit criteria air pollutants and toxic air pollutants that present health risks to the workers at facilities and to neighboring communities, and are disproportionately located in communities of color and low-income communities. In the US, we've seen some progress in the past 2 years from the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which included several provisions to tackle industrial emissions, but significantly more work is needed. So as we enter into the next administration, where we are likely to see inaction or reversals on climate policy at the federal level, it's particularly important that states fill the gap and push forward on pioneering ambitious policies for industrial decarbonization. Each state has a unique makeup of industrial production and therefore is going to require a different set of policies. We'll start by looking at the emission profiles between the states and then get into the type of policies that are currently being used. So for this report, we focus on the production of building material related products, namely cement and concrete, iron and steel, aluminum, and other mineral and metal related industries, both because they make up a large percentage of the industrial emissions and because of their large-scale necessity across society without many existing substitutes. These policies are therefore not focused on how to decrease production, but how to transform it to be more clean. We chose not to focus on other industrial subsectors like chemical and petrochemical manufacturing because overproduction is core to the problem there, such as the use of single-use plastics. And so the solutions require a different approach and warrant their own separate analysis. So building materials are responsible for about 15% of global GHG emissions. And while we have begun to see emissions lower in the US, we're still far from the rate of reduction needed to meet our climate goals. On the graph, you can see the breakdown of those different building material related products that I mentioned. As you can see, concrete, which is made from cement, is the highest emitting of these sectors. Because concrete is, quite frankly, everywhere, it is the second most widely used material in the world after water. We also see iron and steel is, unsurprisingly, also one of the highest sectors. We also find steel in everything from buildings to cars to appliances. Let's go to the next slide. And here we can see a breakdown of these emissions by state. So cement and concrete, glass and iron and steel. There are a couple more of these in the full report if you'd like to look at aluminum and lime emissions. And one of the things that might be interesting to point out here is that for certain industries like iron and steel, there really is a concentration of emissions from just a couple states. So we can see that for iron and steel, the majority of emissions come from just Indiana and Ohio. And if these few states made a significant changes, they could make an outsized impact on our national emissions profile. On the other hand, cement and glass is pretty evenly distributed across the states. So we need to see progress throughout the country. Go on to the next slide. So in addition to the climate changing causing emissions, greenhouse gases, all of these sectors also emit co-pollutants that are extremely harmful to our public health, both of facility workers and of neighboring communities. Our report breaks these pollutants down by EPA designated criteria air pollutants, for which there are 6, and building materials emit all 6. And hazardous air pollutants, also referred to as air toxics, for which there are 130. If you click on the screen, it'll show the next graph. Yeah. And so that's showing the hazardous air pollutants, for which we didn't separate those out, those 130, but you can see here that different sectors may have different levels of CO2 emissions, but their co-pollutant emissions may be higher. So for example, while iron and steel emitted less CO2 emissions than cement and concrete, it emits more criteria air pollutants and air toxics. And these co-pollutants can cause cancer, respiratory issues, reproductive issues, and are additionally more concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities. Go to the next slide. I'm going to go into too depth on these breakdowns. You can click and see the next. Just to give you, if you're interested in looking at more of the breakdown of co-pollutants by state, I encourage you to check out these graphs in the report. Move along to the policies to address this. So we've split the solutions into 3 main policy buckets. The first is emission reduction requirements, so setting binding targets for the industrial sector in each state, or implementing something like a cap and invest using market-based strategies. The second is decarbonization incentives, offering grants or tax incentives to facilities to incentivize them to reduce their emissions. And the third is green public procurement, one of which is Buy Clean, in which states can use their purchasing power to to prioritize the purchasing of low embodied carbon materials. So we're going to go through these 3 different buckets, and we encourage states to implement all 3 together for the quickest decarbonization. So next slide. On the left, you'll see the summary recommendations for these policies. I've also included a case study of states throughout, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve into the state policies for each of these policy buckets. In this policy bucket, we can see that setting binding statutory targets or cap and invest programs should be on track with the net zero emissions by 2050. We've seen 3 states implement emission reduction targets specifically for their industrial sectors: Colorado, Massachusetts, and Maine. We've also had 2 states implement cap and trade systems: California and Washington. And these policies can include additional limits for co-pollutants. However, so far, most have just targeted GHG emissions. Also in California, we've seen a goal specifically for the cement sector, which, if you can remember back to that pie chart of the cement emissions, California was the second highest state. So that makes a very big impact. And I'm going to give some details on the Colorado program, since we have Will speaking later and give some more details. So Colorado has 2 programs to regulate energy use and emissions from their industrial facilities called GEM 1 and GEM 2. GEM 1 required 4 facilities, a steel mill, and 3 cement plants to implement the best available technologies and practices to reduce emissions and energy usage. and then they have to continue to reduce emission intensity by additional 5% each year. And the second, GEM 2, requires all facilities in the state with at least 25,000 metric tons of GHGs per year to collectively reduce their emissions 20% by 2030. And facilities that weren't able to do so cost effectively were able to buy GHG credits from other facilities that had already exceeded their requirements. In the case of a shortage of such credits, they were able to pay into a state-managed fund, and that revenue would be used to help finance state decarbonization projects. Facilities were also instructed to cut harmful air pollutants, especially if they were located within a mile of a disproportionately affected community. And so altogether, these are three things that we recommend for these emission reduction requirements, which is if there's revenues that occur, reinvesting them into decarbonization projects and pairing the program with additional air quality programs. To take a step further in air quality programs, we could take a look at New Jersey, which was the first state with an environmental justice law that required the state to reduce the cumulative impact and public health impacts of overburdened communities when deciding how to issue a permit for a polluting facility. New York passed a similar law, giving the permitting agencies the authority to deny permit renewals or modifications if a facility was going to significantly increase the pollution burden of a disadvantaged community. On to the next slide. So several states have established grant programs and tax incentives to alleviate the high costs associated with reducing pollution from industrial facilities, and to make sure that these facilities stay in their jurisdictions. Such programs might help scale the deployment of an emerging technology, which could drive the wider impact across the industrial sector. One example that I wanted to highlight, and that we'll hear Louis talk about more later, is the RISE PA program, which is made possible through the Inflation Reduction Act's CPRG, Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. And this RISE PA is going to provide grants to facilities to carry out decarbonization projects. But for states that don't have this federal funding or need an option that would be easier for a state to finance on its own, you can use a tax credit or exemption program. For example, New Jersey offered a tax credit to concrete producers who could supply low-emission concrete for state-funded construction projects called LECLA. And all in all, providing some of the decarbonization incentives will help these facilities transition faster and complement the emission reduction strategies mentioned earlier to accelerate decarbonization efforts together. Next slide. Final policy bucket is green public procurement programs, or Buy Clean, in which states prioritize the purchase of cleaner materials for public good projects. This serves to create demand for low emission materials and can give emerging technologies a chance to be piloted, and at little or no additional cost to the state. There are now several states with Buy Clean policies. You can see in this table on the right. To dive more into it, that's also included in the report. We saw 13 states commit to implementing Buy Clean programs with the launch of the federal state Buy Clean partnership under the Biden administration. In the table, you can see details on which materials they cover, how they work, and I want to draw attention to Washington's, which was implemented in 2024 after a successful pilot program started in 2021. And Washington built on the lessons learned from many of these other states and also incorporated something new, which was specifying working conditions for employees in facilities impacted by the law. So we recommend that states implement Buy Cleans or other public procurement strategies. And we also recommend that all of these public procurement strategies at the federal, international, and state level work to develop common definitions, data collection strategies, and standards so that producers can be clear about exactly how to measure their embodied carbon emissions and how to report them. Buy Clean programs should also consider toxic emissions associated with the product in addition to greenhouse gases. Final slide. Here we just have the sum up of those recommendations you've seen in the last few slides. I'm not going to read them all out in the interest of time, trying to get us to our fantastic panel. But states are more likely to meet their emission targets by implementing multiple or all of the types of policies that we've mentioned, which really do work together to address both the supply side and demand side barriers to decarbonization. I'll also add that these recommendations are based on policies that we've already seen in action, but certainly states should consider developing new innovative policies that may further reduce their emissions. And as I'm sure everyone tuning into this call can agree, we need to make significant progress on reducing emissions over the next 4 years and beyond, both to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change, but also because communities right now are facing the health impacts of toxic emissions. And so we're going to be looking to states to lead the way and keep our country on track. I hope this overview was helpful to all of you. And of course, if you want to look at more details, paper has much more details on that. And I'm happy to provide any answers you have to questions in the Q&A tab or via email. I'm going to turn it over to the panel presentation with Rima. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much, Jamie. Thank you for that overview. As Jamie mentioned earlier, my name is Rima Bazia. I am the Associate Director for State Climate Policy at CAP, and I am so excited to be helping moderate this panel of speakers that we have today. So let's dive right in. So we know why you all are here. It's about something related to industrial decarbonization, but we want to know more. We want to know more about you all. So I'm going to turn over to the panel and let you all introduce yourselves, where you currently work, and provide some background on what you've worked on so far in your roles. So we could start with Michelle, and then Louis, feel free to go after Michelle, and Will, you can be our last but not least introduction for today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Roberts. I'm the National Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. Very long term. We call ourselves EJHA. Many of the communities that we serve across this nation are what we call legacy-based communities. You've heard the statement made about cumulative impacts. Many of our communities for decades have been bearing the brunt of our nation's most egregious industrial-based pollution. We also, with respect to EJ communities, bear the brunt of toxics and the egregious impacts of toxics thereof that result from cradle to grave and beyond. So with us, this report was very important because of the fact that the end use is very important to us. I will stop there. Thank you for having.
Hello, everyone. My name is Louis Crack, and I'm extremely excited and grateful to be both here and to be leading the Reducing Industrial Sector Emissions in Pennsylvania, or RISE PA program, on behalf of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So RISE PA is a $396 million statewide industrial decarbonization grant program that will substantially reduce not only greenhouse gas emissions, but co-pollutants from Pennsylvania's industrial sector. And it will accomplish this by funding small, medium, and large-scale decarbonization projects at industrial facilities. Prior to RISE PA, I worked in Governor Shapiro's Office of Critical Investments to help maximize the value of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for Pennsylvania. I've also worked in a policy capacity at PADEP and started my career in state government at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture working on farmland preservation. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Good morning, everyone, at least from here in Colorado, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. My name is Will Manis. I'm a senior program manager with the Colorado Energy Office, which is an agency housed underneath the Office of the Governor. We're non-regulatory, so we get to handle oftentimes a lot of the carrots as opposed to the stick. But we do have stakeholder and intervening status to help inform some of the sticks and help Colorado meet its overall greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, which is by 2050, 100% across all sectors. I mainly focus on our industrial decarbonization programs, which are made up of two separate offerings. We have $25 million grant program called the Clean Air Program to fund industrial decarbonization projects. And then we have $168 million refundable tax credit program also targeted at industry and manufacturers to help assist in industrial decarbonization. Really excited to be on the panel. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Rima. Thank you.
Thanks all. And now we have an even better idea of who we're talking with today. A lot of great experience here. So let's dive into our first technical question, which will be directed at Will. So in our report, one of the policy recommendations we make is setting industrial greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. And in the report, we highlighted Colorado as a key example here for their greenhouse gas emissions and energy management for manufacturers programs, also known as GEM, which I will prefer to refer to it as because that is quite a long name. Uh, Both these programs regulate emissions from trade-exposed industrial facilities that release at least 25,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, with the GEM 2 program requiring facilities to collectively achieve a 20% greenhouse gas emissions reduction relative to 2015 levels by 2030. So with this context of these programs, could you share some lessons learned from the process of implementing these GEM programs that you think would be helpful to other states that are trying to also implement similar programs for their industrial facilities?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I would start off by stressing naming conventions. So obviously, that's way too long of a name. So first and foremost, think of something kind of quick and snappy when you're referring to it. But outside of that, I would start by recognizing that the state's Air Pollution Control Division, which is actually housed under a different agency, the Department of Public Health and Environment, was tasked with drafting those rules, not the Energy Office, but we were stakeholders throughout that process. And from a state perspective, I think I would say that first, engaging early and often with all relevant stakeholders and communities that live near or are impacted by those operators that are subject to the regulation. It's obvious to many, but obviously that's where to start. Extremely important. And on that front, making sure that you're communicating the legislative directive, the language clearly, early, and often as you're soliciting feedback and input from all affected parties. Second thing I would highlight, as opposed to GEM, which you touched on, the midstream rulemaking, which is also a part of the industrial sector, that just concluded actually last month, put together a steering committee with midstream operators and experts prior to the rulemaking, with the output being reduction plans. I think that really provided some clarity regarding what industry felt they could do from their perspective going into the rulemaking, set up a nice foundation to build off of. I think that could have been very beneficial for the GEM rulemaking process as that began. And lastly, I kind of mentioned it in my intro there. We provide carrots to go along with the stick. I mentioned our grants, our refundable tax credits, also baked into the rules. There's a credit trading market, which was briefly touched on. So our grants, our refundable tax credits, the credit trading market, those all reward early implementation, and those reaching or exceeding reduction requirements earlier than is necessary. So those are some key takeaways that I'd like to highlight on the GEM front.
Thanks so much for that insight, Will. And, Colorado's been leading in a lot of great ways. So any way to scale out high impact action is key to really carrying forward climate progress. So we'll now move on to the next question, which is directed at Louis. Achieving emission reduction targets will require industrial facilities to invest in cleaner practices. So this includes updating their facilities with technologies that are not powered by fossil fuels, but rather alternatives like electricity that produce little to no emissions. Understanding that this is definitely not a simple task nor a cheap task, a number of states have established decarbonization incentives for industry via grant programs or tax incentives to alleviate the high costs associated with reducing climate and conventional pollution from industrial facilities. One of the states we highlight in this report that is currently embarking on this journey is the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which was awarded an almost, like Louis mentioned earlier, almost $400 million climate pollution reduction grant from the EPA over the summer. I don't know if you've ever won the lottery, but I would assume the feeling is like really similar because that was great to hear. So they received the grant to create a statewide industrial decarbonization incentive program that they are calling the Reducing Industrial Sector Emissions, or RISE PA program. So, Louis, could you share some more details on how this program came together, any lessons that were learned from the experience, and what is ahead for this program rollout?
I would be happy to, Rima. So just for context, the industrial sector is the top emitting sector statewide in Pennsylvania, and it counts for about 30% of the Commonwealth's total greenhouse gas emissions. And so, because of this, I saw an opportunity to try and reduce these emissions by creating a statewide industrial decarbonization grant program that, as you mentioned, was ultimately funded by EPA through the climate pollution reduction grants. But there were many, many months of hard work that went into designing the program. And a lesson learned is that it's really important to get feedback from outside stakeholders. One, to be sure you're designing a program that's actually going to work. And two, you're designing a program that industry actually wants to use. Um, so, to kind of get at these issues, DEP issued a request for information in which we proposed an initial program design along with a list of questions, and we got robust feedback that we then incorporated into the final design that went into our CPRG application. And so, once we found out we were receiving the award back in July of 2024, that's when the real work began. Since July, myself and my colleagues at DEP have been working tirelessly to build out the infrastructure that's needed to administer a program of this size and scale, and that was no small undertaking. But the good news is we're nearing the end of what I call the startup phase, and we are aiming to open RISE PA and begin accepting applications, if all goes according to plan, before the end of January. So we're looking at a early 2025 launch date, which is extremely exciting.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Louis. And I'm also crossing my fingers over here for a successful rollout. It'll be really exciting to see it play out if all goes according to plan. So as we are moving on to our next question is directed at Michelle. So cutting pollution from the industry sector is critical, not just for the sake of hitting emission reduction targets, but essentially protecting public health, especially when it comes to the communities that bear the most exposure, which are typically low income and communities of color. And in the report, we highlight how the production of mineral and metal sector building materials emits hazardous air pollutants, also known as air toxics. And these air toxics include known cancer-causing chemicals and contribute to respiratory, cardiovascular, reproductive, and other diseases. So for you, Michelle, I have a two-part question, and I'll start with the first part, which is, Along with carbon dioxide, which is typically the top liner when we're talking about reducing emissions of something, a pollutant. So, along with carbon dioxide, how can states also consider toxics within their emission reduction strategies?
Thank you so much, and thank you for participating in this panel again. It is so very important to understand that, as I shared earlier, many of the communities that we serve, we call legacy communities, and they've been legacy for a reason. For decades, these communities have been permitted to be, quote, the sacrificial lamb, if you will, of our industrialized nation. So, we talk about pollutants from cradle to grave and beyond. Many of our communities are used to create these products, to then create other products with these products, or possibly transport hazards through the communities, and or even incinerate and dispose of these hazards. So what is important is for us when we are thinking about the development of these projects, this is where the concept of renewable energy and renewables are so important, but then that of the word clean is even more so important. And how do we define clean? We need to make sure that when we look at the end product, that end product is as clean as could be possible. You referenced and cited New Jersey, which is one of our, quote, flagship policies on cumulative impacts. But even our friends in New Jersey would say that it has not gone far enough, right? For them to be able to turn, they need to be, our communities need to be able to say no to additional harm. Unfortunately, not all of these projects will bring, quote, clean energy. It will bring additional harm, which is so hard for us to right now address the chemicals and refining systems, right? We are glad that you, Center for American Project, took on this. This is a great first step to our educating our society and our communities on what it really means when we're talking about clean energy. It is not just what we're putting in, it is what is coming out. It is not just carbon dioxide. We're looking at nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide. The combination of all of these can be a deadly pill to swallow for our communities who are thinking about COPD, congestive pulmonary diseases, these heart diseases, and then on top of that, our communities who don't have access or adequate access to health deliverable systems that will provide them with the remedy and redress that they need to be healthy. So it is a combination that places our communities in direct harm's way. Now, if we're wanting to build that of a bridge or what have you, a transportation system that gets our communities from point A to point B, utilizing the cleanest mechanism of steel possible in that building process, yes, by all means. But if indeed that steel making process is going to create even additional pollution, right? In the end result, then that would not be a good fit of a project for the communities who are already bearing the brunt of the disparities of that of toxics. But again, this is a great first start, and we appreciate this report that was done by the Center for American Progress. And also, we want to be mindful of language that we need to, not only do we need to address that of decarbonization, but we also need to detoxify our communities. Again, going back to that cradle to grave and beyond concept. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for that insight. And, as you bring up, how do we define what clean really means? And how do we incorporate detoxify, not just decarbonize, into policymaking? I think that's great leadway into the second question that I have for you, which is how can community and EJ groups be engaged in this kind of policy development to ensure that their voices, their experiences, and their considerations are taken into account?
Sure, thank you for that. The beautiful thing is through the Biden-Harris administration, we had community voices actually on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, community voices who were living in the belly of the beast, as we call it, living right there at the fence line. Communities in like Texas, for example, who were impacted by that of the issues coming out of the Baytown, Texas facility, who were even able to articulate the fact that, while this may be different, this is a chemical and refining example, but still they were able to, they being the communities, sought to try to articulate through various vehicles, that of the White House Environmental Advisory Council or the National EPA Advisory Council, letting them know that these funded projects should not include or produce more harm on communities, let alone workers. So I cite that Baytown facility as an example where community members as well as workers actually addressed the concerns and harms that they felt would result into harm, as opposed to that of being a functional project. But again, this is something completely different from that of looking at the minerals piece that you were highlighting in the report, which is a harder lift for communities to address. So it's going to take a moral and political will and courage for us all to work together to try to make sure that we elevate that of public health, not just that of the communities that are fence line to these spaces, but equally the workers who will be working in, with, and around these activities and projects.
Thanks so much for that insight, Michelle. And again, it's very critically important to make sure that these communities are being protected through the right precautions and actions. So really appreciate your insight here. So we have another question directed to you, Will, regarding Buy Clean and green public procurement policy. So Colorado is one of several states that has implemented this policy. And for a little bit of context for the audience, Buy Clean policy sets limits on maximum global warming potential of materials used in public projects. So Colorado's policy includes a wide set of eligible materials. It incorporates a mechanism that potentially results in ratcheting the strength of the program and really does serve to be a great model for other states that want to adopt a similar measure. So Will, can you speak to how Colorado identified its priorities when deciding how to implement this Buy Clean policy and which stakeholders were key for engagement in that process?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just to set the table here for Bike Clean, as CAP's report demonstrates, Colorado acknowledges the science. So we recognize that we need to make moves on the decarbonization front, as demonstrated through the roadmaps we've come out with, legislation, and then subsequent follow-along actions. So Bike Clean really just makes sense on numerous fronts for Colorado and was a natural fit, recognizing what we referenced earlier with the industrial sector's movement with GEM rulemakings, with the carrots that we have as well. But I think, yeah, diving into your question, I'd again preface my response by saying that this policy was implemented by the Office of the State Architect, or I'll refer to it as OSA, and not the Energy Office. However, from a state perspective, we think OSA did the research, had a well thought out process when identifying those priorities. So they researched eligible material categories in the Buy Clean statute that was passed and the available levers available to them for setting those GWPs that you had referenced for all those different materials. They analyzed each eligible material category and its environmental impacts through what we call EDPs, or environmental product declarations, that were identified in the materials that met the initial, we call it industry readiness criteria. And industry readiness criteria is essentially the level of development and availability of a product and the industry-wide EPDs, you could think of it that way, but those that have high GWP impact and should be included in the Buy Clean Colorado Act. And essentially, we're using a lot of these materials. What are we using commonly? What's very carbon intensive? Do we have mechanisms to spur advancement here? And how do we get the most bang for our buck? Because we do have all of these different climate policies and that overarching goal of net zero by 2050. So that info was shared with different state departments and institutes of higher education for review and some initial input, since they are the OSA's clientele, and that they ensure compliance with OSA policies and those procedures. You'll notice there that I mentioned state departments and IHEs, we call them. Hopefully, we can all agree that it's imperative, no matter what level of government you are, you recognize you're not the smartest person in the room all the time. So, like other state agencies, OSA's policies, they're really consensus created documents and policies at the end of the day. They solicited input from their clients, from state departments, from institutions of higher education. They worked with professional associations, trade associations to gain some additional expertise and support. And I would say on top of that, they received input from state departments, IHEs, to ensure feasibility for state projects. They worked with other stakeholders. I mentioned material trade associations, very key folks throughout this process. So at the end of the day, OSA compiled a list of relevant eligible materials, and those material trade associations, they reached out to them, provided training about Buy Clean Colorado, what it was, what they're trying to do, requested feedback for setting those GWP thresholds. They met individually with all these trade associations to verify that industry was ready, and that these EPDs were able to be reached, and determine how comfortable each association was with that. Then they decided which materials to include in the Buy Clean program based on all of that feedback from all of those stakeholders and industry readiness and all of those items that I did mention there. So it really very similar approach across a lot of our state policies and programs. Identify key players, make sure you're doing your homework, solicit feedback early and often, make sure you recognize first and foremost, you're not the smartest person in the room. It's a collaborative effort on all of this.
Thanks so much, Will, for that insight. And I really like your take on collaboration is key. I think that's a rhetoric that can be said across a lot of effective policymaking. So thanks you again for that insight. Well, that concludes the organized question asking panel for this segment of the panel. And now we can move into our audience Q&A. So we've been collecting questions that have been asked from the audience members, and I'll again direct who these questions will be for, and I'm sure the audience will be eager to hear a response. So this is a question that could be answered by all. So I'll start off with Louis here. So the bringing in of the new year is also going to bring in a new federal administration. And with that means that carrying climate progress forward, the responsibility of that is essentially going to fall to the states because the incoming federal administration is not so supportive of a climate progressive agenda. So starting with you, Louie, and then we'll move on to Michelle and then Will. What do you think is the most important thing, or what are the most important things that states should be doing to offset a lack of federal action on industrial decarbonization and detoxification?
I think this is such an important question, so thank you for asking it. Um, so my advice would be take advantage of federal resources while they're still around. So a great example of this is the Department of Energy has the Industrial Training and Assessment Centers, or ITAC, implementation grant program. And this program provides grants of up to $300,000, which is not an insignificant amount, to small and medium-sized manufacturers to implement energy efficiency projects. And this program is actually funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA. Um, so it is, in my view, safer from being repealed than funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as we're all aware, is definitely on the chopping block with the incoming administration. So if you work in state government or for an advocacy organization, you could do outreach to small and medium-sized manufacturers, in your area, in your state, to let them know about this opportunity and heavily encourage them to apply. My understanding too is that the application itself for the ITAC program is they have tried to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. There are some eligibility criteria that can be a little tricky, but it is a fantastic program, and let's get those dollars spent and those projects, implemented.
Great insight there, Louie. The same question, Michelle, if you have a response.
Yes, no, I thank you, Louis, for lifting that up. I fully agree with what Louis is saying. And in addition to that, there are advocacy groups out there who are across this nation who are willing to assist groups with working through the application process. Although, as Louis said, the application is relatively simple and easy to work through, but there are folks out there willing to help. So we would encourage people to take advantage of all of those particular resources that are remaining out there to do so.
Thank you, Michelle. And lastly, Will, same question.
Yeah, I would first and foremost say I agree wholeheartedly with Louis and Michelle. Take advantage of those federal resources while they're out there. I would also highlight something that our governor said last week during the State of the States. Essentially, work with anyone who's willing to help. That collaborative nature again. So get that input, get creative. Oftentimes, creative solutions can be the greatest solutions. Um, Reach out to others, reach out to me. I'm sure Louis would be more than happy to discuss what's going on there. Reach out to other states that are doing something that you're interested in, just to kind of poke around, see what's out there. But really just get going and start asking those questions, get input, um, and yeah, kind of go from there. I think there's a lot of different creative strategies that we've developed here in Colorado that I'm more than happy to share kind of the thought process that went in behind that. But yeah, I guess I'd kind of leave it there and also highlight those federal resources while we have them. Make sure to utilize those.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, this is all, I think, great advice and great insight. As a quick follow-up, and I want to open it to anyone on the panel here, given the insight you just gave on how states can still work to move forward in the absence of federal support, How do you expect the next administration to impact the state work on industrial decarbonization currently underway?
Yeah, I guess I could start with that. I think Louis might have more to say on this, but I would say we're fortunate here in Colorado that grant program that I had mentioned and the refundable tax credits, so almost $200 million in carrots for industrial decarbonization, those are all funded through the state. And we also have obviously some regulation here, so we're not heavily dependent on federal support for what we already have in the works. We'll continue to examine opportunities to work with the federal government to um, promote and spur industrial innovation, decarbonization at the end of the day, and look for opportunities to do so. But I would say we're in a unique position here where a lot of this is state funded. So the new administration, while we may not be able to utilize a lot of new resources from them, will continue to trudge forward with what we have, which is quite a bit. Look at legislation, potentially regulation, potentially more avenues to incentivize decarbonization, policies like buy clean, things of that nature. But with that, I think I'll pass it over to Louis. I'm sure you have quite a bit to say on this. So.
Thanks, Will. So there has been quite a lot of speculation, and I would say quite a lot of anxiety about what is going to happen to federal funding that has already gone out the door under the Inflation Reduction Act in particular. How safe is the funding? Is it going to get clawed back? What can we do to protect it? There's been a lot of discussion from a lot of folks around those issues. And I get asked questions regarding the RISE PA program, having received a substantial chunk of that federal funding, is the money going to get clawed back? And so, from the RISE PA perspective, the really good news is we have a fully executed grant agreement with EPA. And what that means is the money has officially been obligated. EPA is legally required to disperse us the funding to administer the RISE PA program. However, in a hostile EPA situation, there could be ways for them to try and claw back the money, but they're very limited and specific. So within our terms and conditions of our award, if we were to violate any of our terms and conditions, which there are 64 pages of terms and conditions, EPA would have grounds to terminate our award, meaning they don't have to pay us any more than they already have. It's over, you're done. So it remains to be seen again if a hostile EPA would come in and try and use that in a creative way to terminate the award. The other important thing to understand about not only the RISE PA program, anything funded through CPRG, and most of the grants through the Inflation Reduction Grant, through the Inflation Reduction Grant Act. I've got grants on the brain in case you couldn't tell. They're disbursement grants. And what this means is we don't have $396 million just sitting on our state books that we can just go and, pluck from whenever we need. We have to make a disbursement request and send that to EPA, and then they disperse a portion of the funding, and then we, distribute that. So the question remains, like, if we requested disbursement, could EPA just not disperse us the money? They are legally required to, so we would have grounds to take them to court if they didn't disperse the money. But it opens a question of, like, how's that going to work? Are they going to delay the process? Are they going to try and impede our progress? And I think, what we won't know until we're in the situation is, how the incoming administration may try to find creative ways or maybe easy ways to just throw sand in the gears and impede progress in lieu of outright, trying to claw back the money.
Thanks so much, Louis, for that insight. And yeah, I'm sure states clearly have been working hard in preparation for what might or might not happen. So, navigation of barriers, I'm sure, will be key. But I feel like states like yourself, the work is being done to be prepared for that. So to move on to a next question from the audience, this one's for Michelle. What can states do to prevent supporting projects that exacerbate harms on communities from toxic pollution?
Well, there can be hopefully progressive state regulators with a heart that actually put in policies and regulations and orders that address the need to prevent those projects from being funded. It is important to and that actually what do you say that would prioritize that of public health. And so therefore call in for and that actually brings in a healthy economy for the state itself, if you will. So looking at how it is that they address the work and labor force through these new projects and the new projects that are, quote, healthier with respect to outcomes, if you will. That would be a great way of seeking to try to begin something like that. But again, it would begin locally through your local small business administration, local elected officials, working as my colleagues were saying here, in a healthy collaborative way, where you're looking at collaborative tables that would actually cobble together that language so it's coming from all walks. And therefore, that is a state collaborative mandate, if you will, that people are actually striving towards. Those types of things can indeed happen. They've happened before, and they can happen again.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Appreciate that insight. So we are running into the last minute of our session, and there's one last question from our audience that Will or Louis, if you want to take a little bit of time to maybe address. So the question is, have you had engagement with organized labor during your policy implementation processes, and can you provide your thoughts on the value of their inclusion?
I'll maybe jump in here. As part of the stakeholder engagement that we did through the creation of the RISE PA program, one of the key constituencies that we involved early on in the process was organized labor. And in our application, we submitted letters of support, and we got multiple letters of support from organized labor groups that we included in our application to reflect the engagement that we did and the buy-in from the labor community. Because these projects just won't succeed if there aren't well-skilled workers who can implement the work. So absolutely bring labor to the table, bring them to the table early. And I'll also say we incorporated a bonus award within the RISE PA program focused on fair labor specifically, that we workshopped with those labor organizations to make sure that we're giving additional funding for projects that uphold fair labor practices. So, really for us, the success was bringing industry together with environmental advocates and labor, and to get those three constituencies all on the same page, wanting the same thing, was a truly special accomplishment.
Thanks so much, Louis, and appreciate your insight there. I know we are currently 1 minute over the final time. So, but for good reason. This has been a great discussion, but I will cap it here. So just want to say thank you so much to Michelle, Will, and Louie for your time, for your insight. I hope the audience has learned as much as I have today. Big shout out to Jamie for leading the work on the report that was published. And we appreciate you all coming and hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you, everybody, and take care.